Hello! In this video we're going to see part of the history of the British Empire and how it developed into a Commonwealth of Nations. We're going to recover some knowledge from Cultura 1 because you already know about the empire, and we're going to add new knowledge for you to understand the new developments. Let's start here. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. Why was this conference important? It was very important because the most powerful representatives of Europe got together in Berlin, and they decided on this new principle that they would put into practice, especially in relation to Africa. Two of the most important representatives of Europe at that time were Otto von Bismarck from Germany, the German Chancellor, and King Leopold II from Belgium. What was this principle about? The principle of effective occupation meant that the first country to arrive in a territory in Africa could claim the possession of that territory. So, effective occupation was enough as a title of possession. That was how this principle worked. What was the result of this? The result was that all these powers of Europe ran into Africa to get new territories. And Britain was one of those powers of Europe. As you can see, shaded in this color, all the possessions that Britain got in Africa. So what did this mean? This meant that there was a new empire, a second empire, different from the first empire that had been built in America. There was this second empire, which was also a colored empire, because the inhabitants of these new territories were mainly people of color. The new empire then implied that there had been an old empire, or a first empire, or a white empire. That white empire, as you know, and this is knowledge from Cultura 1, had partially become dissolved with the loss of the American colonies. But there were some remains, and Britain decided to reformulate her links with that part of the old empire. Let's go back to some knowledge from Cultura 1. You know that there were colonies in North America. There were part of those colonies had become independent. They became independent in 1776 when the United States was born as a country. But there were some territories, there was a colony, an important colony, English colony in North America, that was Canada. And you know the problems between Upper Canada and Lower Canada. And you know that this man that you can see on the slide was sent to Canada to inquire into the situation and report on that situation and recommend solutions. That was Lord Durham. Lord Durham, the man was Lord Durham, and the report was Lord Durham's report on Canada. Well, among the recommendations there was this Act of Union, the reunion of both territories, Upper and Lower Canada, and that gradually led to the 1867 British North America Act. That was this act that turned the relationship between Canada and Great Britain into a different one. What kind of relationship was there between both countries? This new status of Canada within the empire. Dominion status. What did dominion status mean? Dominion status meant that Canada would decide upon all internal questions, but all international matters would be in the hands of the Parliament at Westminster, that is to say, the British Parliament. So, autonomy in internal affairs, but dependence in the case of external affairs, right? In time, those two territories would separate again and become Quebec, as you can see there, okay, and Ottawa in Canada. Then the rest of the provinces would eventually join. But the Canadian was not the only case of a dominion within the British Empire. There were other dominions that followed this Canadian model. And in 1901, Australia emerged as the Federation of Australia, there. Then in 1907, New Zealand. And then between 1909 and 1910, the Union of South Africa also became a dominion. So we see then that there was a part of the empire that could no longer be called an empire, though it was formally still called an empire, because the colonies were no longer subjected completely. They were independent in their internal affairs, but they depended on Britain for their external affairs. So, new relationships demanded new names. In the same way, these territories, these colonies, were no longer called colonies but dominions, and that happened after the 1907 Imperial Conference. They were no longer part of an empire, but they were part of a Commonwealth, what was called the Commonwealth of Nations. In this Commonwealth of Nations, the relationship between the mother country and the dominions continued to develop. And in 1926, there was a declaration or a formula that was put forth. It was called the Balfour Declaration. And this concept of dominion status was reformulated. And from then on, dominion status meant absolute independence between the mother country and the dominion. That is to say, the dominions were absolutely independent. There were some prerogatives that the Parliament at Westminster kept, but they were not put into practice after 1931, because in 1931, through the Statute of Westminster, the contents of the Balfour Declaration were made law of the land. So now the dominions became the members of the Commonwealth. And as you can see in this following slide, this Commonwealth was made up of what was called the White Colonies. This was then the White Empire. But we saw that there was another empire. There was a colored empire that was made up of those colonies in Africa that were the result of the scramble for Africa at the end of the 19th century. And it was also made up of colonies in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, for example. And the leading country among these colonies was the country that was called the jewel of the crown. Notice that I sometimes use the word country to refer to the colonies. I am somehow anticipating the later status of these territories. So this colored empire was led in some way, but by the Indian subcontinent, by the jewel of the crown. Why? Because there was there a very important man who became the leader of this movement towards the independence, first of India and Pakistan, and then of the rest of the colored empire. That was Mohandas Gandhi, later called Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi had lived in Africa, but in the second decade of the 20th century, he went back to India, and there he organized the Indian National Congress, within which he worked for the independence of India. What is important about Gandhi? Well, the way in which he fought, the methodology that he used to fight, this methodology of civil disobedience. You must have watched a lot of films about Gandhi showing this civil disobedience, this peaceful resistance to the British authority that would eventually lead to India's independence. What sparked the bonfire in this process? Well, in the late 1930s, when Britain entered the Second World War, India was not asked about whether she wanted to enter the war or not. She was driven into the war by Great Britain because India was a colony, an absolutely subjected colony. So this civil disobedience of the 20s and the 30s intensified, and in the 1940s, Lord Mountbatten was appointed the last Viceroy of India, with instructions of preparing India for independence. Well, the process was a really very, very violent process, because there was not only this fight of India against Britain, but there were also ethnic and religious clashes among the Indian people too, especially between the Hindus and the Muslims in India. So much so that when India was granted independence by Great Britain, that happened on August the 15th, 1947, not only India became independent, but also Pakistan, that is to say, mostly Hindu country and a mostly Muslim country. And they both initiated the process towards the independence of this black empire. This process of independence intensified in the 60s, and the final liquidation of the empire came about in the 70s. One question that we should ask ourselves is, first of all, why is India, for example, and many other countries within the Commonwealth, because after 1947, India could decide to become part of the Commonwealth, but the problem was that India did not want to be a monarchy, did not want to acknowledge the English monarch as the monarch of India too. And the answer to this question is in a conference that took place in 1949, which was called the Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference. And at that conference, a declaration was put forth, the content of which was that India would be allowed to remain in the Commonwealth, to be part of the Commonwealth, but not as a monarchy, but as a republic. Other considerations that were taken into account in this conference were that the position of head of the Commonwealth was created, and that was a position that would be covered by the British monarch, and that this organization would be called the Commonwealth of Nations. The other question that we should ask ourselves is whether this empire was finally liquidated, as Churchill had stated some years before. Did the empire cease to exist? Is it that there's no British Empire anymore? Well, look here. This is the situation today. Britain still has overseas territories. There is a United Kingdom there, but there are territories in the rest of the world that are called British overseas territories, some of which are territories that we claim as ours, and there are crown dependencies there on the Channel and near Great Britain, which still depend a lot on Great Britain. So I leave you here with these questions to ask yourselves, and I hope you have understood the topic. contact us, please, if you have not. Thank you very much.